Hello everybody and greetings from the University of Alicante in Spain. As much as I would have liked to be physically present at the conference planned to take place in Foucault, and as much as I would have liked to meet many of you in person, we are living very difficult times indeed. We're still fortunate that the conference can still go ahead and be held online. And I am very grateful for this kind invitation. For that reason, I want to express my gratitude to the President of the Japan Society for Medieval English Studies, Professor Yun Terasawa, and the Secretary, Professor Ryuichi Hota, as well to the chair of the organizing committee, Professor Shinobu Wada. To all of you, thank you for inviting me to deliver this lecture. It is a great pleasure and special honor to address the 36th Congress of the Japan Society for Medieval English Studies. Last but not least, let me also thank Professor Koichi Kano of Meiji University. Koichi, I owe you a debt of gratitude for encouraging and facilitating my involvement with JSMES. Having said that, I wish, and I am sure this will be a successful conference. Just before I move to my talk, let me remind you that I have prepared a handout that I believe has been circulated, and it contains the Middle English quotations from which I will be reading. At least since the beginning of the 21st century, we have become acutely aware of the disastrous impact humankind has had on the planet, altering it since the beginning of the industrial age. This alteration has continued. It has actually accelerated and intensified owing to new technological developments and the globalization of the economy. From a physical point of view, the world we live in is markedly different from the one our medieval ancestors inhabited. The countryside now is fragmented with roads, railways, power lines crossing fields and forests. Towns have grown beyond recognition since the Middle Ages, but sufficient material remains survive that hark back to our medieval past and enable us to form an impression of what it might have looked like. But human activity has not only disfigured the medieval soundscape, it has also wreaked havoc on its soundscape. Let me explain the concept of soundscape, a word that was coined by Canadian composer Mary Schaffer and is defined in the OED as follows: the sounds that form an auditory environment. We tend to be less conscious about the transformation of former sonic environments. In the case of landscapes, we do have material remains, mostly in the form of stone structures. But in the case of soundscapes, we have no similar way of recording. The only available evidence comes from ear-witness accounts in the form of, from literature and from mythology. In general, we conceive medieval soundscapes to be quieter than today's, especially in rural areas that were free from noises coming from tractors, chainsaws, trains, planes, traffic, you name it. while urban locations must have been loud, although crowded by other types of noises, mostly related to human activities around markets, churches, taverns, streets, etc. Festivities also populated the soundscape of late medieval Europe, including England, and they normally involved minstrels declaiming poems, normally accompanied by string instruments. These sonic events were ephemeral, and they left no trace other than the impression that they had on their ear witnesses, which I must say they had greater memorial and audiate capacities than present-day audiences. In the Gawain and the Green Knight, the poet mentions such a social occasion in which he heard a romance being recited, and he promises to reproduce it from memory. And this is quotation number 1 in our handout. If ye will listen this lie, but on little while, I shall tell it as tit, as I intun herde with tunge. Because it is set in a fictional context, this referential remark was not enough to substantiate the claim that the Middle English romances were intended for oral delivery. Other textual and linguistic clues have led scholars to believe that the Middle English romances were transmitted on an oral plane. My goal today is not to search the Gawain and the Green Knight for signs of oral memorial transmission. It was indeed intended for oral delivery, but it lacks the typical marks of memorization. Plus, its metrical and linguistic sophistication suggests that it was intended for being read aloud from a manuscript. Instead, today I want to approach this poem from an archaeological perspective with the intention of recovering the soundscape imagined by the Gawain poet. This inquiry runs parallel to scholarly responses to the poet's treatment of the landscape, especially in Gawain's journey to Castle Haut Desert, which contains descriptions evoking actual places that were familiar to the poet and to his audience. Indeed, his landscape portrayals and geographical allusions reveal the Gawain poet's interest in connecting the world of fiction to his auditor's actuality. My contention is that he was not limiting this connection to the physical realm, but he also encompassed the acoustic side of it. To do so, the poet registered aspects of the soundscape that his public could recognize as a representation of their acoustic community. This examination is further justified by the poet's view of hearing. Ending the life of Gawain is likened to making him deaf, and this is quotation number 2. Det dunt that skylde him deve. Deafness is therefore comparable to death, suggesting that in the poet's imagination, hearing was an essential part of being alive. I have organized my lecture in 2 main sections. The first one I've titled The Sounds of Romance, and I will be discussing first human-made noises and later natural sounds produced by animals and by the elements. And there will be a second section that I have titled The Silences of Romance, in which I will be analyzing first episodes with silence understood as a refraining from speech, and secondly, episodes of silence understood as absence of sound or quietness. The sounds of romance. The meaning of sounds, whether natural or human-made, is context-sensitive. That is to say, it depends on the cultural values a community attaches to them. As societies change over time, so do the perception of and relation to the natural environment. And as a result, sounds may acquire new meanings, or they may lose their cultural significance, or they may simply cease to exist. The Gawain poet, in recreating the sounds of his social and natural milieus, is actually giving us a snapshot of how his audience construed their soundscape. In this section, first I want to discuss the sounds of the court. Next, I will talk about the sounds of the hunt. And finally, I will comment on the sounds of nature. So first, the sounds of the court. The narrative action of the romance starts at Camelot, where the knights of the Round Table gather to celebrate Christmas. And we see them as they become engaged in activities pertaining to their social condition. We see them jousting, we see them taking part in tournaments and dancing carols as well. But right after those descriptions, the poet appeals to our auditory senses. This is number 3, quotation number 3 in your handout. Such glam and glare glorious to her, der din upanai, dancing on nichtes. The audience now can imagine the activities of the court on an acoustic plane. We can imagine chivalric exercises that produce pleasing sounds during the day, the glam and glare. And we can also imagine the music that accompanies the evening dances, the dancing on nichtes. These form the fundamental elements of the court's soundscape during the festal period. And no further description seems necessary to the poet because the audience members were expected to be familiar with this type of activity. Next, the poet moves to New Year's Day's celebrations, and he alludes to the ambient sonority. When the guests proceed to the table, we'll learn of the sitting arrangements, the elaborate decorations, and the choice viands. It all looks like a precious painting, but suddenly it comes to life with the entrance of trumpets and kettle drums, announcing the first course of the banquet. And this is number 4 in your handout. Then the first course come with cracking of trumpets, new knackering noise with the nobler peepers, will the warblers and wicked wacknet lot, that mony hurtful he have at her touches. Not content with mentioning the musical instruments, the poet actually wants to capture the acoustic texture of the sounds filling the room. Excuse me. And if you notice line 119, he's actually trying to mimic onomatopoeically the musical tones of trumpets, wilde warblers and wicked wagnet lot. But the description of this festive scene is interrupted abruptly, because we learn about an exogenous sonic event that disrupts all expectation, and this is number 5 in your handout. Another noiseful neeu, ne yet believe, that the lude micht hath live lode to catch. We are not told about the sonic qualities of this new sound or noise. Instead, the poet interprets its narrative significance for us. And in fact, the intrusion of this new sound event marks the beginning of the adventure of the romance. I will talk about this, the effects of this sonic event in the second section of my lecture. In addition to holding court celebration, nobles were also fond of hunting. This was their favorite pastime during the late Middle Ages. I'm going to talk now about the sounds of the hunt. During Gawain's stay in Castle of Desert, Bertilac goes hunting on 3 consecutive days. Besides describing the hunting action of each one of these days, the Gawain poet also records the sonic imprint of the chase and shows his profound knowledge of hunting terminology, liturgy, and conventions. In the first hunt, the poet reports how professional hunters, and this is quotation number 6, blue bigly in bugles trebare motto, is actually referring to a horn signal that was used to convey that dogs were being driven to the hunting grounds. Later on, once the deer have been killed, the huntsmen produce another sound, they blew prease, which in this case means that they were actually rewarding the dogs for their successful engagement. And right after, we hear them, and this is number 7, quotation number 7, we hear them strakande full studly monistif motes. What they are doing is they are signaling the retreat, to go back. In the second hunt, the huntsmen and Bertilac rechatet. They are producing another signal with their horns to summon together the hounds and the hunting party, until the wild boar is killed, and this action marked with another horn signal, that of the priest, which is used to proclaim the death of the animal. The practice of the noble hunt had socially indexical functions. The social differentiation implicit in the language of the hunt becomes conspicuous, or particularly conspicuous, when the terms used are borrowed from Anglo-Norman. In Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, the poet clearly takes advantage of this social stratification, since the poet contains, for example, the earliest occurrence of the verb rechate, a neologism that would be unintelligible to the uninitiated. In following the protocols de règle, the hunting scenes take an aura of social prestige and distinction. Moreover, the poet communicates that this stylized form of hunting brings pleasure to the nobles on an auditory level. Look at quotations number 8 and 9. Then was it left upon list to listen the hundes. It was a pleasure to the ears to listen to the hounds. Number 9. It was the merriest mood that ever men heard. The rich roared that there was rised for renaude saule with lote. The sound of dogs and the racket made when catching the fox are by definition cacophonous to the human ear. But the poet and his acoustic community attach desirable connotations to these sounds. While horn calls are designated with technical terms borrowed from Anglo-Norman, the sounds attributed to the huntsman, to the professional huntsman, take the form of imitative and inarticulate interjections, such as "Hi and war, hiye, hi, hi." These exclamations place these huntsmen in a liminal sonic position close to the hounds, as we can see in number 10. Money, what's the meaty mouth of men and of hundes? In this line, the poet intermingles the many fine cries of huntsmen and hounds without distinction. By contrast, we never hear the Lord let out these sort of interjections, and when he does shout, he chooses a more dignified word of French origin for him. Besides human-made noises, the sonic landscape of the hunt was also populated by the animal's own distinctive sounds. We can imagine how the hounds bayen, they bay, yaule and yelle, they howl and cry out, or how the deer bryen, they bray, or how the wild boar grunted, fnast, snorted, until giving in, yarrande, snarling. Other animals outside the context of the hunt are also registered in the poem. We can hear birds that piped, cheeped, and we can hear cocks crowing to tell the time. And this quotation 11 in your handout. Be that the cock had crowen and cocklet but threes. Realize that this means 1 hour before daybreak. And I want us to be aware that even today we can still hear cocks and we can still recognize their sound, but it's very likely that we lack understanding to decipher the meaning of the sound. Likewise, we would be hard-pressed to decode the meaning of peals from church bells, which are heard in the poem, and this is quotation 12 in your handout. Brungen full richly to summon to the Hersum Evensong on Christmas Eve. Finally, I'm going to talk about the poet's representation of the sounds of nature. And he is indeed sensitive to the environment sounds, in particular water in motion and wind. We can hear steam clattering, brooks that billowed, that bubbled, and quotation number 13, the burn blubbred therein as it boiled hard. And quotation number 14, one Zephyrus Syphilis himself on Ceres and Erebus. Such is the poet's desire to transmit the acoustic effect of these natural elements in 13 and 14 that he has no qualms in expanding the Middle English lexis. For instance, syphilis, that is a French borrowing, and this is the first occurrence of the word in the Middle English corpus. Likewise, he's coining a new word in the case of bluebird, again the first occurrence of this word. And the meaning of these two neologisms would be self-explanatory because of their echoic qualities. Right, I want to sum up my argument for section number 1 and say that the sonic events and references discussed so far suggest that they are not isolated occurrences, but instead part of a predetermined design to articulate a rhetoric of sonority. If scenes of celebration and hunting are common in romance, the Gawain poet endows them with greater performativity by recording their sonic imprint, thus making them more realistic and more authentic. This kind of sound representation does not serve a merely decorative function, nor is it neutral or objective, because the recorded sounds, the emotions they express, and the language used, they all contribute to reinforce the social ideologies and hierarchies of the poet's acoustic. Section number 2, the silences of romance. In Middle English, the word silence has two main meanings. Number 1, the fact of not speaking or a refraining from speech. And number 2, absence of sound, quietness. I used this semantic distinction to organize my second section of the lecture. First, I will analyze silence when it is caused by a refusal to speak, and next I will talk about the absence of sound. So, let's start with the refusal to speak. When the Green Knight demands the knight to be identified, the knights of the Round Table are marveled at the green colour of the newcomer and of his mount, and they choose to leave the question unanswered. And this is quotation number 15 in your handout, which I'll read. The foe to answer was arg, mony a full frek, and all stunned at his steven and stone still setting. In a swoghe silence thurg the salrich, as all were slipped upon sleppe, so slacket horlotes. We realize the poet reveals that many, but not all, of these seasoned knights are reticent to speak simply because they are frightened, they are arg. But all without exception, are astonished by the Green Knight's voice, all stunned at his steven. Therefore, his voice makes a greater impact on the knights than the words that he uttered. That is to say, the sonic presence of the Green Knight is more remarkable than his physical appearance. However, the poet never describes the acoustic characteristics of the Green Knight's steven, of his voice, just as he did with the ominous noise in the opening scene of the adventure of the romance. The only pointer that we get is the verb chosen to introduce the Green Knight's speech. The poet says, he warp. It means he spoke. But probably the word warp has connotations of being rough, abrupt, unfriendly, not fit for a gentleman. The entire hall subsides into a sudden silence that sharply contrasts with the previous overall ambience of celebration. And what we get is that in addition to recounting the silencing effect of the Green Knight's voice, the poet brings this effect to the fore by repeating the same alliterating sibilant sound in 3 consecutive lines. If you go back to quotation 15, you'll notice that it is marked in bold type. But using, we can call this sound symbolism, and the poet wants his audience through this sound symbolism to feel the sonic texture of the signifier as a cue to keep quiet in a swoghe silence through the salrish. Silence now reigning in the room represents the defeat of the previous conviviality. subverting the festive mood of the court and replacing it by a general morose based on fear. The Green Knight explains the purpose of his visit, namely to play a Christmas game with bizarre rules and bizarre outcome. The silence becomes even more oppressive and intolerable. Let's have a look at quotation number 16. If he hem stunnet upon first, stiller were then all the herred men in hall, the he and the low. If before the court's astonishment was caused by the Green Knight's voice, now it is the content of his speech that intensifies the emotional impact. From an auditory point of view, the silence of the knight contrasts with the form of speaking of the visitor, whose challenge is explained loudly. And even when the knights speak, they maintain this different sonic status. I'm talking about the knights of the Round Table. And then in the next collective speech act, they are shown discussing in whisper. This is quotation number 17. Rich together con rune. They want to keep their debate confidential, but the very act of whispering betrays some sort of timidity and suggests that they lack the sufficient confidence to break the silence. The carefree spirit of Arthur and Gawain, when the first part of the beheading game is finished and the Green Knight is gone, is perplexing. Let me read number 18. At that grene, thy lach and grene. To all intents and purposes, the Green Knight's uncanny survival signifies that Gawain has just received his death sentence. And I wonder, how can this be laughable? Can Gawain be really and actually laughing, or is he hiding, silencing his true feelings? Well, it seems to me that the latter option seems more likely if we consider how Arthur himself hides his true feelings and how they are at odds with his outward demonstration. And this is quotation number 19. The Arthur, the hende king, at her had a wonder. He let no semblant be seen, but side full he to the comely Gwen with cortise speech. That a dame to die deny you never, well becomes such craft upon Christmas. Notice how Arthur in these words is addressing the queen, but realize that he is speaking full he. He's speaking very loudly, so that all those present can hear him. His ultimate goal is not merely to calm the queen, but to prevent feelings of fear, feelings of grief to overpower his men. He wants to influence them with his version of events, considering the Green Knight's visit and beheading as standard court entertainment. Right, so what is the rationale for this conduct? I've got a theory. German sociologist Elisabeth Noel Neumann, analyzing opinion polls for the 1965 and 1972 elections in the Federal Republic of Germany, observed a process that is crucial to understand the effects of opinions that are voiced publicly. and she called it Spiral of Silence. And here is the process. In the run-up to the elections, she observed that those in favor of opening relations with the former communist bloc became vocal, whereas those who opposed this view withdrew from public debate. Consequently, those who take the initiative and speak out, they tend to dominate the climate of opinion. This explanation sheds some light on the communicative dynamics and the reaction prompted by the Green Knight. The only ones who speak are Arthur and Gawain, and they express similar views, and they come to occupy the space of public opinion. The other knights become reluctant to contradict them, and they prefer to remain silent. But notice, they do not express approval either. The action of the romance fast forwards to All Saints' Day, and once again Arthur has gathered his knights on a festive occasion, this time to honor Gawain. But their mood is far from celebratory, because they know that Gawain is departing to meet his death. Let's read quotation number 20 in your handout. All full loof of that lad in longing thy were, but nevertheless ne the latter they nevnet but merthe. Mony joyless of that gentle Japes their maten. They realize that they pretend to be cheerful, not just out of deference to Gawain, but also to be in keeping with the dominant climate of opinion. This passage, therefore, reveals the discrepancy between the unuttered thoughts and their outward expression. Such discrepancy is verbalized more explicitly a few lines later, and this is number 21 in your handout. There was much derne dwell driven in the soul, that so worthy as Gawain should wend on that erde. The emotions of grief and injustice that pervade the whole must remain derne, concealed, to respect Arthur's view. In sum, the Green Knight's destabilizing visit compels the king to set in motion a spiraling process that contrives to reduce the general risk perception, even if the adventure can result in his nephew's sacrifice. Well, I've reached now the final section of my lecture, and we'll be talking about silence understood as absence of sound or stillness. And we must admit that it was easier in medieval times to evade ambient noise, either by avoiding urban environments or simply by shutting oneself away in a solitary room. The poet places Gawain in these two types of settings. As we follow him in his journey to castle or desert, his aloneness and his social isolation become apparent, as he is described as loadless, companionless, with no company other than his horse, and with no one to talk to other than God. In these circumstances, the natural soundscape converges with Gawain's mood, as we see in quotation number 2, with birds that piteously their piped for pin of the cold. Once in castle or desert, Gawain is provided with an upstairs private bedchamber where he is allowed to remain in bed. And the poet indicates that the bed is cortined above, that is to say, it is surrounded by curtains which serve for noise reduction. The noise reduction caused by the bird curtains, together with Gawain's secluded accommodation, explains that he can hear the little din the lady of the castle makes when entering the room. We can see that in quotation number 23. And, as in slumbering his lot, slackly he heard a little din at his door, and deadly upon. The narrative discourse is now focalized around a sonic event that in normal circumstances would have gone unnoticed, deafened by ambient sound. But the poet establishes its narrative relevance as starting point for the temptation scenes. This little din announces someone's unexpected entrance, intruding into the acoustic space occupied by Gawain. Stealthily, the lady of the castle manages to sneak into the bed's curtained-in space and sit on the bedside. If you remember, when the Green Knight entered the dining hall at Camelot, Arthur's court plunged into trance-like silence. It happens similarly now, when the lady gets Gawain into a half-conscious state, as in slumbering his lord, as we saw in the quotation before. The whole temptation scene opens with a little din, and it ends, as in quotation 24, with thooten din more, without any further noise, guaranteeing that it is concealed from all other members of the household, and therefore that it has been silenced. In sum, the Gawain poet has recourse to silence as expression of some kind of vulnerability. First, that of the Round Table exposed by the Green Knight's display of bravado, as well as by their failure to speak up against the distorted version of facts promoted by Arthur. The second vulnerability is that of Gawain in his silent journey across Wales that makes him demand the virgin's intercession. And the third is when the lady of the castle sidles into his bedchamber, and Gawain is discomfited and pretends to be asleep. When medieval knights refrain from speaking, something is radically amiss. The poet's focus on silence exposes some fragility in chivalric ideology that pervades the entire text and affects his interpretations, since we are compelled to guess what these characters mean when they keep quiet. And I reach now my conclusions. I hope to have shown that the romance's auditory representation performs functions that are central to the text's narrative development. While there are sounds that simply define the tone of a scene, such as the fanfare when serving the first course, other sonic events like the noise announcing the Green Knight's coming and his unpleasant steven, his voice, are profoundly and organically interwoven with the narrative to become essential for its understanding and appreciation. Similarly, the bird sad singing reflects the protagonist's state of mind, but his thoughts normally lie out of reach, unuttered, silenced. I have tried to reveal the nuances of the various forms of silence in the text and their contrast with other sonic events registered by the poet within a complex rhetoric of sonority designed to reinforce a dominant social ideology. The Gawain poet, in his resolve to establish the sonic landscape's relevance, has deployed all his lexical skills to ensure it is depicted accurately by using a diverse vocabulary that captures all sorts of sonic modulations and makes it recognizable to his elite audience. When he fails to find an English word that meets the metrical and alliterative requirements, the poet does not hesitate to use a French borrowing or to coin a new word, thus alerting his audience to the significance and richness of their soundscape as well as to their language's adaptability. Consequently, his meticulous representation of sounds, noises, and silences aims to produce a reality effect, qualifying the romance as a unique ear witness to the soundscape of the poet's immediate audience. So Gawain and the Green Knight resonates with sounds that are still recognizable, but whose social and cultural functions have changed or are lost to us. It is hoped that by scrutinizing the auditory features of the Gawain poet's oeuvre and his contemporaries, we should be able to gain new insights into what the soundscape of late medieval England was like, how it was imagined, and the literary uses it was put to. Thank you for your attention. I look forward now to receiving your questions and comments, and I'll do my best to answer them appropriately. Goodbye.